Okay, good afternoon, everyone coming in to this, the 385th of our CGHE webinar series. It's 2 o'clock in Oxford, so wherever you are, welcome to this really interesting webinar we've got today. My name's David Mills. I'm Deputy Director of the Centre for Global Higher Education, and it's a real pleasure to be welcoming a team of speakers today. I've had to share my slide screen with you. So we have 3 speakers of the 4: Mark Hanson from the University of Exeter, Dan Brockington from Autonomous University of Barcelona, Pablo Barreiro, who will answer questions from the Millennium Seed Bank at Royal Botanical Gardens, and also not here, but author of the paper is Paolo Crosetto from INRI in Grenoble. So before we get going on the actual presentation, just to remind you, as ever, we record all our webinars. So if you miss this, you can go back to the transcript and to the recordings and to the slides as soon as we put them up on our website. That's a great resource for you all in times to come as well. So do look at that archive. A reminder, as normal, we suggest you keep yourself muted. You don't have to have your video on. Use the speaker view so you can see the speaker and their slides. They can have some really interesting data. During the webinar, they'll speak for about half an hour. Do ask questions in the chat, and then at the end, I'll invite you to come forward and ask your questions. So with no further ado, we will get straight to the topic, which is the strain in scientific publishing. Mark, Dan, Pablo, the screen's all yours. Thank you very much. We might be
And you're muted.
That's good. Perfect.
Okay, good start. Let's see if I can improve on that. Can I thank you very much for that introduction, and can I check that you can see the screen in presentation mode? Okay, that's brilliant. So a couple of points to begin. First of all, thank you very much indeed for the chance to present this work to you. It's longer than I like to think, since I was in Oxford doing my PGCE, so this is a fun return. And thanks particularly to co-authors, Mark, Pablo in his absence, for the chance to participate in this. We are from very different backgrounds, in natural science, economics, anthropology, plant sciences, and fruit flies, isn't it, your speciality, Mark? And what brings us together is our interest in the dynamics of academic publishing, and it is one of the more joyful and exciting collaborations that I've ever been involved in, because we are driven by these questions coming from such different disciplines. And it's also an unequal collaboration, in that you have in Mark, Pablo, and Paolo geniuses in R and web scraping, and in myself, somebody who likes to copy out the results onto the screen by hand. So for my participation, this has been somewhat peripheral. I compare it a little bit to being like a young child watching a firework display. You just think, wow, that was amazing. I want more of that. But you've not really much understanding of how these results were produced. But I think the narrative is something that I can talk to. So I'm very glad that Mark and Pablo are here to answer the hard questions. What we were interested in, though, is what we're calling the strain in scientific publishing, and it derives in part from this graph here, the growth of indexed papers in Web of Science and Scopus, which means, of course, there are many more papers out there which are not being recorded by our data. That line is an exponential increase. I can test its exponentiality, and Pablo explained mathematically, no, this is the best way of explaining it. And we have to say at the outset that there are multiple reasons why this sort of increase can be and should be considered something which can have good results and good consequences. It can be a good thing because we know that the production of scientific knowledge is controlled by gatekeepers. It's dominated by particular epistemic communities who can be bad at recognizing the value of new science and new approaches. And as far as I understand, that if you look at the long-term history of science in all its disciplines, you frequently come across the creation of entirely new journals set up by people who are fed up with the gatekeepers who are preventing them from communicating important concepts, facts, ideas, movements. This is the nature of science, to grow in this sense. It's also a good thing because so many researchers have all sorts of interesting papers in their file drawers which could well be publishable, but editors deem these do not have the scope, the importance for their journal. They want papers which only show particularly powerful results, where disproving a normal hypothesis, getting a negative result is, whilst actually making a contribution to knowledge, is in fact harder to publish. And we should recognize that behind this line is the continued dominance of the global north, which is gradually being contested and diluted, thank goodness, by ever-increasing investment in science globally. I've worked a great deal in Tanzania, and since I began in the early 90s, where we were just working at the University of Dar es Salaam, now I have colleagues who are doing, I would say, world-leading research based in multiple different universities across the country. University of Dodoma, the Nelson Mandela African Institute of Science and Technology. I have students who find jobs at the Open University in Dar es Salaam, or St. John's University in Mwanza. The sector is growing globally, and this increase is reflecting that, and that is welcome. And at the same time, that is not the entire story, because we also see a strain. A fair bit of this is anecdotal. On social media, you can find editors resigning, you find reports of reviewers being overworked. Some of this, in fact, is also published in the academic literature. And of course, we all know the problems of fraud, the paper mill's retraction. Just last week, I think, Wiley announced that they will be sunsetting, withdrawing the Hindawi brand because it's been completely compromised by the massive fraudulent publishing of work that was not nearly as scientific as it claimed to be. And we have in this graph as well a red dotted line showing the award of PhDs in OECD countries, indicating that one of the main factors producing this science and being able to peer review it is declining. And that line stays the same shape if you include India and China. The data reported there are slightly different form, hence we haven't included them in the single graph, but nonetheless, if you move beyond the OECD, you still get the same pattern. And it's important, I think, to step back and to consider the changing meaning of publishing that's taking place here. And we owe these insights to Paolo Crosetto, and these are his slides, which I'm about to show. But Paolo points out that we've got a shift in publishing. It used to be the case when I was cycling around Oxford in the 1990s that journals were found in specific libraries. There was a limited number of journals. There's limited space on the shelves for them. It took a long time to publish, but when you did get an article published, it was free to do so. And if you published, then you could thrive if you did well. And it had the risk, however, that the good science could be rejected. Publishing also means now that we have an almost unlimited supply of journals and certainly unlimited space within a journal to publish our papers. It can take a very short time to get published, and you pay. But if you don't publish, well, then you suffer as a scientist. The danger, of course, being that bad science will get accepted and come through for publication. When I was beginning my academic career, gosh, I sound old saying that, which may be accurate. I wanted to get a special issue out there because it would be special, because it wouldn't come out very frequently. And as editor of a journal, we would get proposals for special issues, which we would monitor and think which one or which two would we want to have that particular year. And there'll be far more regular journal articles and special issue articles. It also means these days that you can have many special issues per day, that they can cover an extraordinary variety of topics. The editorial control over them is relaxed compared to normal, and you have more special issues than regular articles. And I think one of the interesting things about the data that we're going to present is that for the first time, to our knowledge, they provide quantitative backup to the idea that special issues are actually a softer form of publishing. And this is something that we've known about as water cooler conversation, but not seen demonstrated empirically. And publishing business models have changed as well, from cultivating and polishing many small journals for which readers would pay through by subscription, where the emphasis was on maintaining quality and limiting the quantity. And now publishing business models means, well, you can have just a few journals. They can cover a massive variety of topics. Authors pay. Once you get the author's article processing charges, well, then you've made your money. And the incentive there is to increase quantity always, but the questions are for quality. And what we set out to do in this paper was to focus on the behavior of the publishers. And we did this for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because researchers, academics are really good at talking about ourselves, our own communities, but there are millions, tens of millions of us globally. And we're really good at talking about our employers, our universities, our research institutions, the research councils who ultimately drive this output. And there are thousands, tens of thousands of them globally, 3 orders of magnitude less, but nonetheless quite a large group. But we don't very often talk about the publishers. How many academic publishers are there? Up to 100? Again, 3 orders of magnitude less, a much smaller group, but much more identifiable as a group who can behave in particular ways. And when you focus on the big organizations who contribute the vast majority of publications, we're talking about 20, maybe even 10 companies. So it makes sense to focus on the publishers. But what we don't see is a comparative focus. It's quite common to focus on individual groups, to complain about Elsevier's profit making or to raise questions about MDPI. But until we see the data in comparative form, it's difficult to reflect on the publishing as a whole. And so with that introduction, Mark, shall I hand over to you to talk about the methods that we used, and then we'll share some of the results.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so before we get to the results, just to say exactly what we did. We used the SciMago website. This is a product of Elsevier, and it uses the Scopus database as its database. But we filtered our data set for both Scopus and Clarivate Web of Science indexed articles. So what we're showing here, as Dan alluded to, is a subset of the total indexed articles in the world. It's actually a subset that's quite restrictive to things that are indexed by both of these companies. Next slide, please. We also complemented that with web scraping. And so from the SciMago database, we get total journals, and we also know articles per journal. From the web scraping, we got information about the constitution of those articles. So we learned things like whether they belonged to a special issue or a research theme or a research topic, depending on which journal you're talking about. And we learned things like what the turnaround time is for those articles, which we defined as the time from the very first submission to the final acceptance. And we also, next slide, please. Maybe I'll just point, Dan, if you're willing. We also collected some data by direct request to the publishers. And so we actually got in touch with all of these groups in advance. Some of them gave us data, access to their corpus of information independently. And we also put our article, our manuscript, to these publishers for commentary before we did a public release. And so we had feedback from each of these groups, or at least offered the opportunity to. And so when we talk about our results, we're talking about this strain on scientific publishing. And this is our effort in order to characterize this strain. Fundamentally, Dan was alluding to this earlier, we have this exponential growth in total articles. We have a lack of growth in PhDs or researcher hours equivalent. And this is the growth in annual articles at this intersect of both Web of Science and Scopus. And in 2016, just to give a sense of magnitude for this issue, in 2016, there were 1.9 million articles indexed by both Web of Science and Scopus. In 2022, that had ballooned up to 2.8 million. And the number of actual practicing researchers doing the writing, the editing, and the digesting of that information has not really changed that much. And that's why we call this strain. We're all doing a lot more work in terms of writing and reviewing and reading these articles per person. And so we're kind of overworked, even just relative to 5 years ago. And when we look at what groups, as Dan was very eloquently put, what groups are hosting this growth, we can largely pin this down to a few major publishers to get at the majority of this growth. And a couple groups stand out. MDPI, for instance, has grown quite a lot in terms of the volume of literature it's added since 2016. So out of that extra 1 million articles since 2016, MDPI makes up 27% of that. At the same time, groups like Frontiers, which are also known for special issues, are part of this. But traditional publishers with this subscription model, or now more of a hybrid approach like Elsevier, Springer, and Wiley, they've also grown in their total articles. But as you'll see in the next slide, they have not grown in their articles per journal. We've actually seen this growth in journal size and this rise of new mega journals. And this is something a bit unique to the groups like Frontiers and MDPI, where now almost every journal in their group is hosting thousands of articles per year. This is one of these unlimited repository sizes that has enabled this kind of growth, and you don't see this with other publishers. So when we ask sort of, there's this strain, what's going on? We kind of see these two strategies generating this strain, this growth in total articles that is disproportionate to the number of practicing scientists. First, you see a growth in total articles that distributed up across a number of journals. And so there's also been a bit of a growth in total journals. I didn't show that, but together, groups like Elsevier, you have more total articles distributed across more total journals, and you do end up contributing quite a lot more articles per year. But we've also seen this growth in articles per journal. We've also seen this rise of mega journals that has enabled some of this strain. And so when we're talking about threats, when we sort of see this or perish interaction playing out, where researchers are feeling pressured in order to publish more articles, and journals are hosting more articles through these different mechanisms. But as a consequence of that, we're starting to hit a point of saturation and of information overload, where it's becoming difficult to field all of that information. I'll pass it back to Dan to talk about special issues.
Thanks, Mark. Special issue point is relatively easily made when we compare across different publishers. 3 stand out, Frontiers, Hindawi, and MDPI, as producing very large numbers of special issue papers. And MDPI's growth is in fact largely driven by these special issues. You can see that in this graph here, where the red line shows the special issues, and the MDPI steeply and rapidly growing its special issues. But for both all Frontiers and Hindawi and MDPI, there are more special issue papers than regular journal issues. We also looked at turnaround time. This is the data we get from the web scraping. And here we can see, I would say, 3 groups. You've got the top 6 publishers, top 6 as in appearing on your screen, with turnaround times of around about 4 months to 6 months. You have Hindawi and Frontiers declining to less than 3 months, and you have MDPI just over a month, and been just over a month for several years. But it's not just these turnaround times which are this graph here, which is important, because you have to question, how is it possible to review, revise, and re-review within 37 days across an entire range of journals? It's also the fact that there's so little variation in that time. I think the standard deviation was, what, 5 days in this this data set, or across a very large data set. Now, that's a remarkable similarity, which to my mind begs the question of how is that possible for so many different editors in so many different subjects to behave in such a similar way. We can show also, and you can see this in the top 3 panels, that the red lines here of special issues are below the blue lines of regular journals for the turnaround times. In other words, special issues are turned around faster than regular journals. And even in MDPI, where the difference is only 1 or 2 days, it's still a statistically significant difference in the speed of turnaround times. What's going on here? Well, special issues are one of the ways in which journals can grow so quickly, because they're able to leverage the network of their guest editors. The guest editors can source the extra papers which are required, and they can use their networks to enable to find reviewers who are going to be more willing to review quickly papers of colleagues within their networks with obvious threats to quality. We wondered too if it would be possible to see any trends in rejection rates, because if it's getting easier to publish, then one would presume that rejection rates are declining. Here we had a couple of problems with respect to availability of data, because these sorts of data are not in the public domain very easily, with the exception of MDPI, which I think is remarkably good for its level of transparency. There's also changes in and interpretations of the meaning of the word rejection, because you can get rejected if you fail to revise your paper within 2 months. That's a good way of increasing your rejection rate and speeding up your turnaround times if you're a publisher. And it's also possible for rejection rates to be calculated within a calendar year or from the time of each journal's submission. And we split up rejection rates according to the age of the journal, according to the citation rates of the material coming out. And we tried to look for patterns within the data to explain what might be causing changes in rejection rate. And basically, we found that the most important factor in explaining change in rejection rate is the publisher itself. If we compare changes in rejection rate to the normalized start of from when the data become available, you don't get a cross-sectoral pattern, you do get a within publisher pattern. And this is, again, most clearly visible within the MDPI, where rejection rates have declined as journals have grown. However, the most recent figure from late 2023 suggests that rejection rates have gone up again. We were also able to show, and this is for the first time we think, that special issues have lower rejection rates, or rather journals which have more special issues in them have lower rejection rates for those papers. The key thing for us here is that rejection rates are driven by publishers, and there's so little transparency across the sector as to what rejection rates are and how they're determined. Mark.
So I'll pick back up with inflation. And this is a loaded term in 2023, but specifically I'm referring to inflation of impact factor. It's the UK, so I've talked about pound sterling here, but impact factor is this thing where I should say that impact factor is the measure of how many citations an article in a journal receives on average within a given time. So 2 years is the most common. And something we've seen is that impact factors have actually gone up in recent years. I think most people in the audience, whether you use impact factors or you know not to, or whatever your opinion on them, people have a general sense of what a good journal's impact factor is. But something to pay attention to here is that impact factor is kind of a relative metric. And so an impact factor of 3 in 2016 actually is more comparable to an impact factor of 5 in 2022. The actual value of an impact factor has been inflated just in the last 5 or 6 years. And what is behind this inflation? We probed a lot around this. One of the things that might help contribute to understanding this is that the number of references per document has actually increased. You can see this almost exponential growth between 2018 and 2021 here. And that's part of it. But and COVID might explain that. People had a lot more time to write. Review articles might have become more common. But we actually still see growth year over year from 2021 to 2022, even with a decline in the restrictions around COVID. And in order to understand how COVID contributes to all of this, we're kind of waiting on the 2023 data, but we're not convinced that it's the whole story. So instead, I tried to get at a different approach behind this sort of question of the inflation of impact factors. And we create this synthetic metric that we call impact inflation. It's not an impact factor inflation specifically, but rather what impact inflation tries to measure is how much a group has become susceptible to Goodhart's law. So this is a term that's known for describing the situation where a measure, such as an impact factor, becomes a target. When you make something a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So if you want to base total citations as something of a way to judge candidates, to judge papers, to judge their value, you tempt manipulation, subtle or overt, to try and look better in terms of that measure, and that's when it becomes a target, and then it ceases to be a good measure. And so impact factor, as I mentioned, is this metric based on total citations, but we generated impact inflation by a comparison of two metrics. So impact factor is the raw total citations over a given time, most commonly 2 years. And we compared this to a separate metric called the SCImago journal rank. And there's a very complex formula behind SCImago journal rank, but the fundamental difference between these two is that SCImago uses a network approach. And one of the ways that they differ fundamentally is that impact factor just cares about the raw total citations, but it doesn't track where those citations come from. By taking a network approach, SCImago can track where the citations come from, and it puts limits on how much reward and how much prestige you can earn from self-citation or journals citing themselves, or even just small cliques of journals in small networks, providing lots of group citations. And so it's this ratio of the impact factor to the SCImago journal rank that we use as our metric of impact inflation, our measure of Goodhart's law. And when we look at this ratio, what we see is that a couple groups stand out, and there are group names that we've heard a couple times now already. MDPI and Hindawi are, very significantly different from all the other groups in terms of their extent of impact inflation. Something that was actually a bit surprising here, because we saw this growth in special issues, we saw this growth in mega journals, we saw these declining turnaround times, but we don't actually see this citation behavior difference in the group frontiers. So there are differences between these groups, and that's an important distinction to make. I also mentioned that impact inflation comes from this behavior of citations. It's easy to think about this as self-citations. And so we looked at the self-cite rate, which is available. This is journals citing articles from their own journal. And again, you see that MDPI is far and away a major outlier in this data set. We don't see the same sort of self-citation rate in Hindawi, and we don't see it in Frontiers or other groups. But going back to that impact inflation, this is a measure both of self-citation rate, and it's a network-based approach. So what we do see is that there's a high impact inflation for some groups, and there's also a high self-cite rate for MDPI in particular. And so what is going on here? Everyone's impact factor is going up. The actual value of a given number for an impact factor has increased over the last few years. And using sort of comparisons between raw citations and network-based approaches, we can see that some groups have a very small network of citations from a small pool of journals, maybe lower rank journals. And one group in particular cites themselves quite a lot. And the threats here are that, we have limited time. Committees have limited time, and we do try to avoid taking shortcuts, but we find our perceptions defaulting to shortcuts at some times, and those quality signals that we rely on can become distorted, and also younger scientists or scientists from different groups can start to be misled by these quality signals, which publishers themselves also like to advertise as bravado, So with that, I'll pass it back to Dan.
Okay, and we've got a couple of minutes, I think, to wrap things up. So our main empirical contribution is at the end of this paper, where we put together the data for different publishers, which brings out the fact that the increase derives from all publishers, some more than others, of course. It brings out the fact that everyone is engaged in some form of gaming of the metric. Everyone's inflation is increasing. MDPI stands out with bells on. It has by the second greatest increase in total papers. The second greatest contribution in absolute terms of total papers, the largest share of special issues, shortest turnaround times, lowest rejection rate, and change in all those figures too. What we think is going on here is that MDPI and other publishers like them, Frontiers now, Hindawi once, are being very successful in their business model. That authors who are driven by the publish or perish model and are encouraged to do so, but effectively or not discouraged sufficiently by funders, and by that we mean universities as well, are helping to drive this model. And where you have a business model which rents space, as Paolo pointed out in his first blog on the topic, in reputable journals, so you have this pressure to increase the quality of the quantity of the science coming out, with the results that your quality signal will be distorted and you risk wasting time and money. In our conclusions, and I'll do this very briefly, obviously exponential growth cannot be sustained. We can see Goodhart's law in operation with respect to impact factors, inflation. It's incorrect to conclude that this is driven by open access publishing, because PLOS, for example, does not demonstrate the same problems. This is due to the business model that is operationalized with open access in some cases. We found it difficult to do this work, or at least my colleagues found it hard to do all the web scraping. And at the same time, we've shied away from using terms like predatory presses, which we find in some of the commentary about this. And the reason that I'm in particular don't like this term is because I think we need to think of, in Braudel's language, of a system which feeds predators. He talked about the great predators that operate in capitalism, where government and companies work together to generate profit. And I think we have a very similar situation in academic publishing, where the publishers are negotiating directly with governments, with funders and other such institutions for their resources. And it is in that context, this is the system which we have to pay our attention to, more than just the individual companies. And therefore, we think that funders, universities, have a much bigger role to play in regulating all of this. Mark, do you have final comments? Should we?
Thanks for your attention.
Indeed, thank you all. I'll stop sharing and we can respond to questions.
Mark, Dan, Pablo, and obviously Paolo in absence. That was great. Some really interesting data. Lots for us to think with. I'm going to cover a couple of clarifications before I invite. Please do post questions in the chat. Just first off, you started off by saying that this you were looking at the growth in cited articles in the two indexes, but then a lot of the subsequent data was from the publishers themselves, wasn't it? It wasn't simply data on cited articles. Is that right? So if you're looking at the MDPI impacting inflation, am I right in thinking it's the whole of their corpus?
We did filter, so it's a good question. For the figures on total articles and total journal growth, it comes from the SciMago data. For the impact inflation stuff with the impact factor and the self-citation rates, that also comes from this intersect of Scopus and Web of Science.
Okay.
For the turnaround times, for the special issues, for the rejection rates, we did use the web scraping data sets, and there we weren't able to apply the same filters. So it does include articles that weren't being counted in the other figures.
It would just be interesting to know whether there's different patterns from those. But I mean, obviously, that's a hard thing for you to work out. Yeah. So my question then is slightly different, which is, I mean, in some ways, the very creation of the citation index was Eugene Garfield's response to the overwhelmingness of the data flows post-war. So we have this constant problem, don't we? That it always feels like science is overwhelming. And there's too much, and so I want to reflect on that. Whether actually, if one historicizes, one could look through time and see And I think I have seen graphs that would show a log graph that would show a constant exponential growth, whatever point in history you looked. But then my other question really was more to Dan, and Dan, you started with this lovely image of Tanzania and the researchers there doing great research and that explaining this growth, that we have a global sort of system which is growing. And then I was thinking of Julius Nyere's comment that when the rest of the world walks, we must run, which was a sort of response to how Africa had to keep up. And so whether there's something going on here where if you are on the margins, you're excluded from the elite, your journal isn't indexed, then one way you make up is by working harder, publishing faster. And I have to say that I've been doing some reviewing recently for MDPI, just as a participant observer, just to try and understand what it's like. And I've been fascinated by the ways in which they set me very tight times for reviewing. I have to respond within a week, and I was interested by that because it did make me respond. And there is something there about the changing expectations on the academics. But so there's a couple of different comments there for you.
Thanks. So yes and no with respect to running and walking. I've recently started working with the Journal of the Geographical Association of Tanzania as an editor. And we are very keen on getting indexed in the right journals to raise the profile and standard of the journals, because if we are indexed, then our colleagues in Tanzania would be more likely to seek to publish with us. But you cannot use an article that you've paid article processing charges for any promotion bid. The standards would prevent that. So it's a platinum bid publishing business model. So it's free to publish, free to read. So in some respects, it's not a case of just doing everything better and faster. The rules are slightly different.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much, Dan. At which point I'm going to hand over to the audience. We've got some great questions already coming in, and our first question is from a publisher. If that's okay, Madeline, Maki, do you want to come in and ask a question?
Hi, David. Thank you. Just to clarify for everybody, David forwarded this on to me. We are working on a special issue for Global Africa at the moment that's looking at publishing. So this is exactly the sort of stuff that I've been looking into in respect of African studies. So kind of just a few observations from my side, really. And I think what I found from African studies is, certainly publishing special issues is around the same as general articles. It's still the same rigorous publishing, still double anonymous peer review. We're generally not publishing those faster in our particular subject area as well. And I think also just differentiating between the different types of special issues. So the traditional form of the special issue, where it would appear in print and online as one sort of set all together. And then this kind of evolving nature of the article collection, where they're ongoing, they're open, authors can submit to them at any point, rather than kind of being a closed thing. So I think the traditional special issue, there might be a call for papers, or it might come fully formed, from a conference or perhaps from a group, as opposed to people submitting on their own to an article collection. And I know definitely at TNF we're seeing more of these article collections, and I think that's more along the MDPI frontiers type model there, where it's not closed off once it's done. You can keep on adding to those sorts of things as well. It was interesting also to see on the decision times as well. I think TNF was noted for 167 days, and from my own looking into the African studies, we were 161 days. So we're nearly sort of spot on there with the average, around a 5-month time from authors submitting to getting that first post peer review decision there. So I mean, I think I could probably talk for days, but that was just a few observations there, and maybe just a shout out for the special issue that David's working on, that will have all sorts of stuff like this in case anybody's interested from the African studies point of view. Thank you.
So that wasn't meant to be an advertising break, but anyone got some comments or responses to Madeline? Madeline, you work for Taylor & Francis, just for disclosure. Yeah.
Sorry, yes, just to clarify, yeah, African studies at Routledge Taylor & Francis.
Yeah.
Mark.
I can maybe field this one as a comment. And first, thank you for the perspective. I think Pablo noted in the chat that we weren't able to collect data on the turnaround on the special issue status of Taylor & Francis articles in the same way. So our data set doesn't actually cover them in the same way. And it's worth pointing out, we generally paint this as a broad trend because it was true for most publishers, but there was one exception in our graph where actually special issues took longer to turn around than regular issues for Springer as a specific publisher. And our definition of Springer is specifically Springer and not Springer Nature. The Nature portfolio is separated, the BMC portfolio is separated. And so those are caveats in our data set. So there's also a publisher-specific set of circumstances for these special issue trends, and it's absolutely true that different publishers have these different models. So I know, for instance, working with the Royal Society, there are 2 journals that are dedicated to special issues, Philosophical Transactions, and they have a process where you have to submit an idea with planned abstracts already present, kind of like your conference example, where that whole idea, even just to write the articles, has to get a pre-approval. And then it takes a year or more just for those articles to be organized. And then all of them are only released simultaneously at the very end. You don't have this progressive incremental release of articles. So this special issue difference, it can come from different models. But in that case, in something like the Philosophical Transactions, you might expect that actually there's sort of a difference based, well, actually, maybe I'll just stop there. I'll just stop there. I think that's the key point. Yeah.
Dan, did you want to come in? No.
No, I was hoping Andrea Lane could come online.
Yes,
to ask
please,
her.
Andrew. I was going to ask you to come in, but that'd be great.
Hi there. Thank you very much for the presentation. Really appreciate it. Really enjoyed it. I just wonder, I mean, MDPI is kind of in the media recently for being like a predatory publisher, and the other one you had listed, the initial on the list that also had so many special issues. They had the Indian one. They had a lot of withdrawals of paper recently, I think over 500 papers. So I just wonder if you exclude those 2 from the records, from the data set, is that then a significantly different picture of publishing emerging, or is it really not much different then?
Not significantly different. It would be my brief take home. MDPI is responsible for 27% of the growth, which means another 73% coming from the other companies. It is an outlier in the trends, but it's still in the other companies have been moving in the same direction. It is part of a bigger picture, and the push that we're trying to argue for in our paper is to see the bigger picture and not to focus on just one company. Yes, things have got so bad with Hindawi that its owner has decided to withdraw the brand completely and Hindawi journals into other Wiley journals. So there have been particularly bad instances within publishing, but the point to understand is that these are bad instances of a broader pattern. Mark, have I got that right? Would you add to that?
Yeah, the only thing I would add maybe is that we focused on the largest publishers because we wanted to sort of make a point of collecting this data under what made sense. But there are a number of groups just under our threshold for being highlighted that also contribute a great number of articles through special issue growth and through these sorts of same strategies. So I hesitate to point them out, sort of to put them on blast, so to speak. But you know, this is not just these 5 groups. There's a global and there's a broader community contributing to this.
Okay. And can I just have a follow-up question, David, quickly? Maybe that is beyond the scope. I missed the first 6 minutes, but did you look at specific subjects as well? Is it mostly business subject? Is it engineering? Is it science? Can you see some trends there? Or you didn't look at this yet?
Yeah, we haven't looked at this in that way quite yet. It's something a bit on our to-do list, but it's actually a bit more complex than it might first appear, because we have to do a bit of a publisher by discipline interaction, and when we have to do that, it balloons in size in terms of the interaction terms. So what we can say is that our data set is filtered specifically for STEM. And so showing that PhD data set originally, for instance, that comes from just STEM graduates and not arts and humanities in the OECD data set. And we have supplemental figures on different measures of total researchers. And when we look at the data set of total journals that are contributing, at, I think 99%, maybe it was 99.9% of the articles that we're looking at are in fields that involve some form of STEM. So the data we're looking at is STEM based, and you could delineate physics, chemistry, biology, engineering, etc. But at least we have that level of understanding.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, Mark, let's jump in with a methodological question. You said how good MDPI were with sharing their data. Tell us a bit more about how hard was it to get all the publishers to share some of that data, or were you surprised at their willingness to participate?
So there's an interesting story with respect to MDPI data in that they have been for several years way ahead of the field with respect to the openness of their data on their website. And I got into this having challenged an MDPI editor to share their rejection rate data, and found in fact they did across all their journals. Those rejection data were removed in 2021, wasn't it? From the from the visible domain of most web browsers, but retained in the HTML code, so that whenever one logged on to the MDPI website, one downloaded those data. We're not sure how aware everybody was within the company that this was the case, because when we shared our paper with MDPI, they wanted to know where we got our data from, and shortly after that, that facility of downloading rejection rate data by logging onto the website was removed. And now it's back again. Okay. So once again, in terms of transparency, you have to recognize that the positive contribution that they're making, it hasn't always been so easy. I think Pablo and Mark can tell us far more though about the ease of other publishers.
I'll leave it to Pablo. He's got the handle on this.
It's a lot of data. It's a lot of data. I still have nightmares about getting the data, but MDPI it's one of the most transparent publishers out there. I don't think we got any data from them, but we could get everything from their website, so there was no need to make like a broad request. Then PLOS and Hindawi are also very transparent. You can download all the papers with a click, so no need to do any web scraping. I remember Wiley, it's you cannot text mine the website. So we got in contact with them and then assembled the data for us. They sent us like 100 gigabytes of data. That was a good nightmare as well. Taylor and Francis was useful in some bits, and I think they sort of ignored some of our requests, but at least we got something. My favorite one is Elsevier, which I'm still sending emails to them just to see if they come back one day with the data. So Elsevier, we had to use a little bit of web scraping and also information from Crossref. Crossref is such a really good source of information for this kind of papers. It's usually when you do text mining, eventually the server of the publisher kicks you out because they think you are stealing data. But the server of Crossref, you can do whatever you want with it and it won't complain. You can be downloading data 4 days straight and they don't care.
Maybe that's a good opportunity to comment on Elsevier too, because as I mentioned, we didn't unite Nature Portfolio and BMC into the Springer Nature group, even though they are authorized as they're licensed under the Springer Nature brand. We did that because we used the licensing of the publisher label in SciMago as a metric of how independent these groups were. And Elsevier takes a lot of flack a lot of the time, but they are massive, right? They're a huge publishing group. And so when we tried to put a request to Elsevier, it just got lost in the mail. Both Pablo and I did this, and we're still waiting on a proper response. But I will say, just to their credit, that they have a website called Elsevier Insights, and that's where some of our data come from. And so that website aggregates data from across Elsevier branded journals, but on a volunteer basis. And so some journals contribute their acceptance rates, their turnaround times through that website, but it's a completely, it is not a standardized data set. And so it's a sampling of convenience there. And I think that speaks to the transparency request, is that a lot of the work we had to do was a sampling of convenience based on what we could do. And it would be a lot more beneficial to the publishing community as a whole if these sorts of data were available in a standardized way and reported in a standardized way.
That sounds like a pitch for a very large research grant, Mark, but I think that's a very good idea. Absolutely. I mean, because everyone benefits from transparency and understand what's going on. And I guess there's also benchmarking.
If I could jump in on this
Pablo,
one,
yes,
some publishers have come back to us and they've asked us how they can improve their transparency. So we've told them maybe you should do like, I like to put always the PLOS example because all the data it's online, and analyzing the data from PLOS takes less than a day. Well, if you need to get the data from a different publisher, it might take you weeks because you need to do all the text mining. And we have a couple of publishers that are planning to do that. And I hope everybody does the same because it will make this sort of analysis. Everybody could do this. You don't need to be an expert in text mining, or everybody should be able to do this kind of work and interpret the data by themselves.
Sure, good. I have a question from Francis, which is really apposite here about the pressures on editors. Francis, do you want to ask the question?
I can see Francis's question.
Yes, so she's left. Okay, in which case, perhaps you want to speak to the question. The question is, just in case you can't see it, is about the pressures on editors and on the editorial function and their payment.
Yeah, so our editors, who is delivering these exponentially increasing editorial functions? So I think we had a slide on that briefly where we kind of made a point that the model of the special issue, maybe the reason that it's been so successful as an engine for growth is because it's scalable. So by outsourcing the editorial function to guest editors, this is something that journals solicit by email more frequently these days. You can take a pool of academic staff in the journal and just put them in charge of managing guest editors that are external to the journal, but might be invited to come in and do editorial work for free. So in terms of your question of who is delivering this and are they being increasingly well paid for their time, I can't speak to the profits or the revenues of the companies because we don't have that data, a transparency thing. But I can say that in many cases, the editors that are actually doing this work are not being compensated fiscally. Journals might contribute waivers or discounts or things, but there's no real pay being given to these editors. And because it's scalable, because you don't have to hire more academic staff, you can fill these nearly limitless repositories with increasing amounts of information to a point. And that's where the strain comes in, because we're treating editors as an infinite resource, and we're realizing more and more that people are a finite resource in this system.
Absolutely. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to ask a final one, if I may, which is your last slide referred Dan to the Wellcome recommendation that universities have to regulate the system. And funders. Is part of the problem here that the rules of the game need to be changed in order for that to happen? That actually, regulation is not going to work unless you actually get the incentives right. So it's less about rules than money.
Yes, it is about money. It's partly about get the incentives for researcher behavior, but I think it's also a lot to do with what deals universities, research councils, governments are prepared to strike with publishers themselves. It's fascinating that the Swiss National Science Foundation have, in the last 2 weeks, announced that they are not going to fund the article processing charges of special issues. Now, if you do the numbers, they pay for 315 special issue papers a year, special issue articles a year. So not masses, but approaching half of it's, I think, 40% of the papers they actually fund. So it's a significant proportion of their portfolio, and it's a signal to others. Is it Malaysia, which has also banned publication in MDPI and Hindawi? Is that?
I know what you're referring to. There have been universities in Czechia, China, and it might have been Malaysia that have now said that it's not that the publications are banned, and this is something funders have to wrestle with, but they don't contribute to your academic progression, your career progression. So they're not considered as part of your end of year review in terms of your output.
And it's that sort of pressure, David, that I'm talking, because the government of Malaysia can speak for tens of thousands of researchers in a moment and say, if you want to publish here, fine, but we're not going to count that, nor are we going to pay for it. And particularly when they stop paying for it, at that point, the publishers will sit up and take notice.
No, I'm sure you're right about the money. I mean, it's just interesting that if special issues become seen as the problem, then that Royal Society journal that Mark described, that is just special issue journal, is also sort of hit, isn't it?
Yeah, it's one of those things where the definition of the term is shifted, and it's one of those things where we could collectively define what is and is not good practice, independent of trying to collect it under a label. So yeah, a return to the former definition, if possible, is something that would be welcome to me personally. But maybe I'll close by actually mentioning too that, as Dan mentioned, we are from very different academic walks of life, and we also have, we're all fascinated by this question. We also have slightly different utopian views of where to go from here. And that's something that's really interesting, because we also see these reactions, like from the Swiss National Science Foundation. The Directory of Open Access Journals just issued a new criteria for special issues and policing of publishers that are allowed to be indexed in Directory of Open Access Journals. And we have generally positive or at least mixed opinions. We like to see change moving forward. We like to see an impact people actually moving on this topic finally. And fundamentally, this is a question that we four cannot be the ones to answer for you. This is something that needs to take place. This conversation needs to take place among everybody. And we highlight the funders, the funding agencies and universities and institutes as needing to be leaders in that conversation, but it really needs to be a global conversation and not just something that's edict from the top down.
Absolutely. Well, I think we're very lucky today, because the very fact of your very different disciplinary fields, so often these things get addressed from the perspective of the social sciences, and actually it's really important that we know and understand how these dynamics play out by field, and obviously by country. So thank you all very much. Really interesting set of data. I hope you can take it further, and like you, I think we all have utopian visions for the future for how this might change, and it is interesting seeing how quickly the debates move on, isn't it, within the European Union? Lots of talk about moving to a sort of non-profit model of funding open science. Whether that's ever going to happen or what that would look like is all to play for. But look forward to seeing more of you. Thank you very much, all of you. And everyone coming, thank you very much. The webinar will be posted as soon as we can, with the recording and the transcript and the slides as well. And then on Tuesday, we have another webinar as normal, which is on teaching English in Japan as foreign, female, and non-native. So please come back, join us as ever for more. Thank you, Rich, again. Bye-bye.